Good morning again, church. My name's John, one of the pastors here. If you're new to our church, we're grateful you'd be here. We'd love to meet you. If you've been here for a long time, we also are glad you're here. We love that we get to do this together. So go ahead and take your copy of God's Word. Turn with me to 1 Samuel. We're going through this book. We'll be in chapter 8 today, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, you may have noticed that I have a loop of climbing rope up here. We thought of having me rappel down from the ceiling, but that might be a bit too much. So this is what we're going to do with this. It's just something that is an illustration of what I heard a pastor talk about one time, the difference between rappelling and climbing. That there is a difference. Maybe you don't understand that, but let me explain it. When you rappel, you start at the top of a rock face and you kind of lean back onto the rope, and to get down, you have to put your whole weight on the rope as you kind of hop or walk down the rock face. But when you rock climb, you are finding footholds and handholds to climb up the rock face, and the rope is there merely if you fall off, if you misstep, and you are secure in case you fall. There's other people who actually climb with no ropes, but that's who most people would do, is they climb with a rope as a safety net. Have you ever considered that maybe that's what you are doing in your relationship with God? Do you merely want God as your safety net, as your rope if you fall? But primarily you're trusting in your own strength as you climb in life. Do you not fully trust him like you would when you rappel down the face? We're actually going to see an example of that today in 1 Samuel as we continue our journey through this book. We're coming today to a pivotal section regarding the shift to a monarchy that's been building throughout 1 Samuel. Now there's the distinct moment where this happens. In reality, though, there's a deeper question. It's not just structural government type stuff. We're going to see a civics lesson. The deeper question that is asked here is, who shall reign? Who shall reign? Who will sit on the throne of the people's hearts? Who will sit on the throne of their nation? Yes, but who's going to sit on the throne of their hearts? Who's going to be the one to protect them and prosper them and fulfill them? Who's going to be the one they trust to do that? And we're faced with similar questions today, right? Who's going to sit on the throne of our hearts? Who will we trust to bring us prosperity and security and fulfillment? Those are essential questions that we'll see today. Look now at chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. The name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, which is a very south part of the nation. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain, and they took bribes and perverted justice. Sounds familiar to what we saw, right, with Eli and his sons. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they've done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So a lot of time has passed since we saw Samuel as a young boy left in the tabernacle to serve the Lord. And a long time has passed as he's been called to ministry. He's actually been serving publicly. But what Samuel did here, we learn, is that he was actually perpetuating the same system of government that they had had prior. In fact, he was doing it in a way that was kind of creating this lineage, in a sense, perpetuating what would turn into being the monarchy. Like he was opening the door wide open to it, appointing his sons as judges. Like that's just what they did. And so the door swings open, the people ask, but like I've said this before, none of these things surprised God. In fact, all the way back in Deuteronomy 17, verse 20, God had told Israel he would give them a king one day. So God knew this was coming. It was the way that they asked here that displeased God. Did you see it, right? Verse 8, God said Israel had forsaken him. They'd served these other gods. In fact, in verse 7, we put this as the main point on your notes. God said it this way: they have rejected me from being king over them. Right, God said that. Listen again. They have rejected me from being king over them. Just think about that for a second. God already was their king. He was the one who would protect them, prosper them, fulfill them. But they rejected him as that. A word that brings with it the idea of contempt. You could almost read this like they spit in his face whenever they said, no, we don't want you as our king. We want another king. They got impatient, right? I mean, because just think about their situation. They had physical needs that they had to have met. They had these enemies that were lurking all around them all the time. And they thought they needed someone more tangible, more reliable than an invisible God. They weren't really sure where he was, but they need somebody they can see who can lead them into battle, which is a rejection of the very thing that made them distinct from all the nations around them. How silly they were, right? Like we would never do that. As Dwight would say, false, right? We do this all the time. Here's one way. We need to see a couple extra zeros at the end of our bank account just to make sure we're secure. Maybe this one. Here's how we can place our hope outside of God. We can hope in something other than God. Every day on the news, every day on your Facebook feed claims this is the most consequential election in history. They said it 4 years ago. They said it 4 years ago before that. They'll say it in 4 years from now. Everyone. And what it does is it stirs up fear. It stirs up this panic, and we're placing our hope in something outside of God. And listen, even as I say that, we live in a democratic republic, so we have the privilege to get to vote. So pray, vote your conscience. Yes, absolutely do that. But let's stop acting as if a certain candidate gets elected or a certain candidate doesn't get elected, then the whole world will spin out of control. Right? Because is God not sovereign over this thing? Does he not have a plan? Is he not good? Here's my point. Whether it's a politician or a job or a spouse or a bank account or whatever it is, we forsake God when we trust any other king. We forsake God. Now notice this is in quotes, the king word, right? We forsake God when we trust any other king. Because here's the truth. God is the king. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. In fact, I love the way Psalm 47 puts it. Clap your hands, all peoples. Shout to God with loud songs of joy. For the Lord, Yahweh, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth. Sing praises to God. Sing praises to our King. Sing praises, for God is the King of all the earth. Sing praises with a psalm. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. So hear me this. We cannot knock him off his throne. He absolutely is, always will be. That's his rightful place. But here's what we can do. Just like Israel did. We can forsake him with contempt. We can act as if we're the king of our own lives. We've got a chair. Listen, I heard one of our staff members told me this, that their child wrote this simple one-sentence story. And it was a boy named Bob who had a chair and he liked to play king with it. Is that not what we see happen every single day in our own hearts? We have a chair and we like to play king with it. We think we're the king of our own lives. We act as if this or that will give us protection or provision or fulfillment, that's what's gonna be our hope. That's what's going to be sufficient and suffice for us. That's what we mean by king here. You can't take God off his throne, but anything we look to for provision, protection, fulfillment, anything we seek to find it, which the Bible also identifies as idolatry. It doesn't have to be figurines and things on shelves. It can be what you look for, what I look for purpose and provision and fulfillment. That's the king we're talking about. And only God was meant to carry the weight of kingship in our lives. Nothing else. It's all shifting, crumbling foundations. Only God can be the true king and carry that. Now back to the story. Did you see what God told Samuel in verse 9? Samuel's like, hey, God, they asked for a king. God's like, okay, give him a king. But you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. Be careful what you ask for, right? Because look how Samuel then spoke to the people. Look at verses 10 through 18. And kids, listen for something. I'm gonna emphasize a word. So kids, try to check in. Listen to what I say, what I emphasize here, verses 10 through 18. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the 10th of your grain of your vineyards, give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your flocks and he shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Did you catch it? Here's why I emphasize that. Because what God was telling the people there is that any other king will only take, he will not give. Any king that we set up will take from us, not give to us. Now, what Samuel was describing was the common practice of kings back then at his time. It's how worldly kings functioned back then. It makes total sense, right? They needed young men in their army to defend the nation, and so they would conscript these young men. They would assign some to work in his fields, because he had a lot of fields to provide for all the things he needed, to work in his palace, to do work in the manufacturing, all of that. He would snatch the fields of people to provide for his people that he had working for him. And in the end, what it led to was enslaving the people. which is why verse 18, in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you've chosen for yourselves. In other words, God was saying, hey, I'm warning you, this will not go well. If you do it the way you want to, it's not going to end well. In fact, I love this, 2 Chronicles 12:8 in the New Living Translation. God says, they, Israel, will become the king's subjects, slaves, so they will know the difference between serving me and serving earthly rulers. Like, we have a choice. Who are we going to serve? See, but again, like I said, it wasn't the request for a king that was necessarily wrong, because God said it was going to come. It was the way they went about it. That as they asked for this worldly king, they also, in the same breath, rejected God. That's why God said to them, okay, I'll give you what you want, but here's what's going to come of it. This is what's going to happen when you do it the world's way. Because do you remember why Israel would be willing to submit to this worldly king? Why would they even do this? Remember, it was because they felt this lack of security. They felt this lack of prosperity. They looked around and they saw that a worldly king would be better. We need somebody to lead us into battle like everybody else around us. We have this felt need here. We need to do something that would fix it. But remember what it ended up doing. Taking and taking and taking some more from them. But again, we can't sit here a couple thousand years later and look back and say, you guys have no clue. Because don't we do the same thing? Don't we get ourselves in the same situation they did? We feel a lack in our lives, and so we turn to something else to fix it. We turn to a king that can never satisfy, that was never intended to satisfy, but instead of giving what we need, it only takes from us. You heard it at the beginning of the service today. We turn to things like pornography to try to satisfy the lust of our flesh, and what it ends up doing is it destroys and rots away our minds. It only takes from us. It takes families away. Or you sacrifice yourself to climb that corporate ladder, but what it ends up doing is it destroys your family. It only takes from you. Or you set up a relationship as the fulfillment that you know you need, but what it ends up doing is it steals your joy when that person inevitably lets you down. And you've looked to have it give you something, and instead it takes away something from you. Listen, if we present ourselves to any other king, it's not going to save us. In fact, it's only going to tyrannize us. It will only take, it will only take, it will only take. It will not give you what it promises it will give you. It will not make you happy. It will only steal your joy. It will steal your peace. And Jesus said it very simply. Familiar verse, John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So why do we do it? Why do we walk down roads that lead to stealing and death, destruction? Why do we turn to these other kings in our lives? Well, watch why we see Israel Here, chapter 8, 1 Samuel 8, verses 19 through 22. Remember, he had just warned them. This is what's going to happen. If you ask for a king like everybody else, this is what's going to happen. He warned them. Watch, verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice, make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. You see what happened there? The point is, trouble comes when we start comparing. Trouble comes when we start comparing. Listen again to verse 20. Their reasoning. So that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That was their reason. Now, just stop for a second and think about where we've come. That's why we don't read this in a vacuum, right? We've walked from chapter 1 all the way through now. We've watched this happen. Did they forget what had just happened in chapters 5 through 7? Like, did they completely lose the thought? I know it'd been a few years, but do you remember what God did? Do you remember on his own what God did in the whole process? Like the Ark of the Covenant going, and God himself, by himself, invaded Philistia. He executed their god, Dagon. He distributed plagues to the people, and then he brought home all the plunder, and then not only that, he destroyed the Philistine army with thunder and a spirit of confusion. He did that all by himself. And the Israelites were watching all of that happen. No, we still need a king. They could even look back to Exodus. Remember Exodus? God himself plagues and all the people. Red Sea splits open, saves his people from Israel, from Egypt. No, we need a king we can see. Now listen, all the other nations around us have a king. We need one too. But listen, isn't that the same reason that we so quickly trust in other things besides God too? We forget what God has done, but then we look around and we see that, man, their life seems so good. That seems to be working for them. So maybe I need that too. Maybe I'm missing out on something here. And instead of trusting the invisible yet powerful God who works on his timing, not ours, what we start doing is we start drifting away to all these other weak kings, trusting them to fix it somehow. We see God as our safety net, not as our full trust. See, you and I can be climbing the rock face of our lives. We're sure glad that God is there if we'd ever need him. But we don't really fully trust to where we're leaning back and just falling, knowing he's got it. What is that? It's pride. It's a rejection of God as king over us. And so where's the hope in this chapter? Because it just kind of ends Samuel's frustrated. It seems like, get out of here. I don't even want to see you anymore, right? Where's the hope here? We know Israel's going to get a king soon, but how do we understand this chapter? Because this is really the crux of the whole thing. Well, here's what we need. We need to go back a little bit. To help us understand this, we need to go back in our minds to the book of Deuteronomy, where just a few hundred years earlier, God had told the people through Moses how this whole thing was going to go. Listen to this. This is before they even entered the land. It's kind of in the process of them coming into the land. There's all of that, but they definitely were not settled. This was not home yet. But listen to what God says to the people. This is Deuteronomy 17. He says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I'll set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who's not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him. He shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of the law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right or the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So notice what God did hundreds of years before 1 Samuel 8. He said, hey guys, this thing could work. It actually could work this way. Even with a king, it could work. But did you see the conditions? And I want you to see this, because this has to be in our minds. As we go forward through 1 Samuel, as we go through 2 Samuel, as we go through the rest of the Old Testament, this has to be right on the forefront of our minds. Thinking about the king, he says the king must be chosen by the Lord, not by people. The king must be native to Israel, not a foreigner. The king can't trust his wealth or his resources. The king cannot have many wives that would turn his heart away toward the lust of the flesh. But there was also this, the last caveat. He said they have to keep God's word and the priesthood right in front of their face so that they would obey God in holiness and humility. It's the only way this was going to work. And notice the result. Did you see that? So that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Again, this thing could work, guys. In spite of the people asking wrongly, in spite of their rebellion against God, the Lord set it up to work in this way. In spite of themselves, God would continue to work to bring about his redemptive purposes in Israel through a righteous king. And we'll see it some in Saul. We'll see it a lot in David. We'll see it a little bit throughout the rest of the history of Israel. The problem was none of those kings could live up to that standard perfectly. Not one of them could fully fulfill the design God had for a righteous king in Israel. None of them. Even with the conditions God set, what the people were wanting would never satisfy them. That's why in God's grace, he gives us what we need. In God's grace, he gives us what we actually need. What they needed and what we needed was a perfect king. a chosen son of David, native Israelite, who fully trusts in and fully obedient to his God. And here's what that means. All of these kings in Israel's history that we will see in 1st and 2nd Samuel, that we'll see throughout the rest of it, they were all but shadows of the true king that was to come, whose name is Jesus. They were contrasts to what he would come to do perfectly, where he would come, listen, to serve, not to be served. Where he would come and die for those who disappointed him, not attack those who disappointed him. Where he would come to give to others rather than take from others. And listen, it's the same thing for every other king that you and I pursue in our daily lives. Those that we choose to follow, those that promise happiness but only end up taking from us, this God is an altogether different king. He was faithful to Israel even when they were not faithful to him. And he is faithful to us. Even today, he is faithful. And here's how he proved it. Through the cross of Jesus Christ, the ultimate display of God's love and God's faithfulness, the ultimate giving of what we truly needed. It's found there only. Listen, church, that's why we can lean back off the rock face and say, God, you got this. And we don't have to try to climb and find our foothold and our handle. We don't have to, because God is the one holding us. He's a good king.